pap smears are sexual violence, which I feel like is disrespectful to people who have actually experienced.
Pap smears absolutely can be sexual violence, and I realize that is a controversial take. That's probably going to piss people off, but I don't care and I never have, so of course I'm going to be the person to stand up and talk about this. So let's talk about it. Now, of course, I'm not saying that all pap smears are sexual violence. I'm not saying that every single person who's ever gotten a pap smear was sexually assaulted. Of course, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that they can be. If you feel like you've been kind of forced into a pap smear, or like your bodily autonomy and your right to choose has been stripped away from you, of course that pap smear is going to feel like sexual assault. Of course that pap smear is going to be sexual assault. And you wouldn't think that really happens, but it does. And I know this not only from personal experience, but also because I've been running a support group for women and AFAB people who have experienced sexual violence in medical settings and medical trauma since 2018 with over 7,000 members. And in that time, I have heard countless stories in which doctors held medication like birth control or hormone replacement therapy hostage until the patient consented to a pap smear. I have heard stories of women waking up from anesthesia to find out they've been given a pap smear without their knowledge or consent. I've even heard a horrifying amount of stories in which a person initially consented to a pap smear, and then once it begun, they realized it was painful, they didn't want it anymore, and they told the doctor to stop, and the doctor fucking ignored them and kept going. I've heard stories in which the pap smear was so painful, the person passed out or threw up from it, and the doctor just acted like that was nothing and kept going. Do you have any idea what it feels like to wake up from a surgery, to realize that someone inserted things into your vagina without your consent? Do you know how horrifying and violating and traumatizing that is? Just take a moment to think about it. Do you know what it feels like to not want something done to your body and being horribly uncomfortable with something, but being told you will lose access to a medication that you need? Sometimes a life-saving medication if you don't do it. Do you know what that feels like to be told, allow vaginal penetration or lose your medication? Do you know what it feels like to be screaming at someone to stop? Be screaming at them to get their hands off of you and they ignore you? Because I do. I know exactly what that feels like, and I know exactly what that feels like in the context of a medical exam. And it's fucking horrifying. It's traumatizing. It forever changes your relationship with your own body, your relationships with other people, and definitely your relationship with healthcare providers and your trust in them. And seeing people saying things like, oh, that's not sexual violence, a gynecological exam can't be sexual violence, is really harmful and invalidating. And I also think it shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what sexual violence is and why it happens. It's not really about sex at all. It's about power and control. But even then, that really only matters if you're looking at sexual violence from a criminal psychology perspective, like trying to understand how and why it happens to prevent it. As far as from the survivor's perspective, from the victim of the act's perspective, that doesn't really matter. The motivations of the perpetrator don't really change much about how it affects the survivor. I don't care if the reason the person is violating my boundaries and stripping away my bodily autonomy is sexually motivated, or if they're doing it to prevent cancer. That doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is that my consent is being taken away, my bodily autonomy is being taken away, my boundaries are being violated. That's the important thing. And this idea that sexual violence cannot occur in the context of a medical exam, or that a medical exam can't feel like sexual violence if you didn't want it or didn't consent to it, prevents people who have experienced it from seeking help. It took me over 10 years to start looking for resources and help to deal with my trauma and what happened to me because of rhetoric like this. And when I did start to search for them, they didn't really exist. Many of the resources and support groups and things like that that exist right now for people who were sexually assaulted in a medical setting exist because I made them. I had to create my own resources because nobody else wanted to do that. They just wanted to gaslight me and say that what happened to me couldn't be what I thought it was. And it's really saddening and disheartening to think that another young woman or AFAB person might be going through something similar right now, and they could see the video I'm stitching and it could discourage them from seeking out those resources in that community. The unfortunate reality is that doctors absolutely do sexually assault people. They absolutely do cross boundaries and violate informed consent. That is a very real thing that happens way more often than any of us want to think about or acknowledge. And that is going to continue happening as long as there are people that refuse to acknowledge it and talk about it and try to shut it down as being anti-medicine, anti-vax, alt-right, propaganda, fear-mongering, blah blah blah. If these conversations keep getting shut down by that idea and that narrative, we're never going to change shit. We're never going to hold providers that are committing these acts accountable. We are never going to have true informed consent. We are never going to have true bodily autonomy for anybody in medical settings. We need to be able to talk about this. We need to be able to raise awareness for this, because that's how we fix it. And I just really wish that people would educate themselves on just how wide of a scope there is of what sexual violence can be and what it can look like. There was a point in time that people did not think that sexual violence could happen within a marriage. And that wasn't even that long ago. And I think that one day in the future, people are going to look back at beliefs like this, beliefs that sexual violence does not happen within the context of a gynecological exam, and feel the same way they feel looking back on the time when marital rape didn't exist. And that is not a side of history that I would want to be on if I were y'all.